Good morning. I hope you can hear me properly. My name is Andres Gutierrez, and I am the Regional Advisor on Social Statistics. I work in the Statistics Division of ECLAC. So let's get started. I'm going to talk about the recommendations for the publication of official statistics from household surveys in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic. So, in summary, I'm going to talk about the recommendations that we have made on gathering labor market information through household surveys. And I'm going to pay particular attention to a statistical concept that is called sample strategy. A sample strategy is a pair. On the one hand, we have the design, the sampling design, and on the other hand, we have the estimation scheme. So I'm going to get deeper on these two concepts um, along the presentation. So these recommendations are published on two short documents. The first one is called Recommendation for the Publication of Official Statistics from Household Surveys in the Context of the Coronavirus Disease COVID-19. And the other one is called Recommendations for Eliminating Selection Bias in Household Surveys. So if you want, you may access to these two documents. They are freely available, of course, in the website of ECLAC. So, yes, as you know, some countries have declared states of emergency. These emergency states arise from the global pandemic, of course, and some governments have declared these movement restrictions in order to stop the spread of the disease and protect people. Difficult decisions have been made, and they have affected society. They have affected institutions. They have affected the education process, the industry, the way that the way that we have used to work. So we have now the telecommuting. We have a new reality, and in this new reality, national statistical offices have had to interrupt the collection of primary information because of they. I mean, they cannot gather information face to face. So uh, these movement restrictions are followed for compulsory quarantines and other health measures. And they have led to the suspension of face-to-face data collections. So national statistical offices are carrying out surveys over the telephone, mostly, and the internet. So this is a new reality. This represents a change in the collection methodology that is necessary if employment and poverty statistics are continued to be produced. And the movement restrictions and quarantines have a particular and important impact and effect on this indicator of employment and poverty. So we need to know what is happening in the labor market and what is happening with the economy, and we need to know how many poor people are in the middle of the pandemic and after the pandemic. So it is very important to continue gathering information. Uh, so this pandemic began for Latin America and the Caribbean in March of 2020. On that date, we recommended we have made some recommendations based on these three possible scenarios. So at left, we have poor coverage levels. So if the sample size or the effective sample size is not enough to produce any official statistics, so we recommended doing nothing with that. I mean, um, this scenario contains a lot of bias or of selection bias that cannot be corrected by any means. So the recommendation is do not produce any official statistics. At your right, we have acceptable coverage, and in that case, we would recommend to continue with the normal publication process on that month. And in the middle, we have something that it is not the best scenario. It is not too bad, and we have to make some research about bias, and we recommended to perform some simulation studies, and based on that, we recommended to adjust the weighting scheme, and we recommended to perform new calibration schemes, and after that, we recommended to publish official statistics only at the national level, because in this scenario, we don't have enough sample size. I mean, the sample size is not enough in order to publish some disaggregated statistics. After that, we have made some other recommendations for subsequent months, and these recommendations are based on a panel survey. So as long as movement restriction remains in force, it will be almost impossible to carry out face-to-face data collection for household surveys. So we must to modify the way in which we collect the information, and we have to embrace the telephone ways or online interviews. And this, of course, poses several challenges, but given that the telephone numbers of the households in the survey sample are collected usually in the first visit of a survey, so we have this data. We have the telephone numbers available for the households that were included in the sample. So, for example, here at the left, we have a first scenario. We have January, February, usual survey, March, maybe a partial survey, and the question is, what do we do in April and in the months and in the months in which we are or we continue with these movement restrictions. So, for example, in April, maybe we can follow up. We can perform a follow up of the January 2020 sample. And in the subsequent months, we can continue to using this January 2020 sample. So when the quarantine ends, we may reintroduce the usual design. And if you note, as the contact information of the household is usually collected in the first visit, so we have access to the telephone numbers of maybe all of the households that were selected in the sample of January. So the recommendation is that national statistical offices adopt a temporary change in the design of the household surveys and choose to follow up a sample panel in the following months. And this panel should be composed of those who were surveyed in the months immediately preceding March 2020, for example, January. This way, following up on a panel, we have concluded that it is a simple and effective way to have a probabilistic sample in order to compute the necessary statistics. And this strategy is free from selection biases. And it will allow to make these estimations. I mean, the computation of the estimates. And the January 2020 sample is not biased because, of course, that sample comes from a sample design that is correct, and of course that sample is not biased. So if the National Statistical Office do or do not have the enough budget, so we have this scenario at the right hand, and they can follow up a subsample of February, for example. But here it is our most prominent recommendation, that is to follow a sample in the quarantine months. So of course that at the end the sample that comes from April, May, June, or July, the effective respondents can have some sort of bias because we have changed the household survey data collection modality from face-to-face interviews to a telephone-based modality, and that may generate biases, of course, of coverage and non-response. So we have to pay attention to those issues. So at the end, the recommendation, as I just said, is to define a sample of households from a previous period and contact those selected households for they to provide current information. However, of course, not all the households in the original sample provided their telephone contact information. Some households provided their contact information, but at the time of the interview, I mean in the current time, it happens that they do not live at the selected address. Or maybe some households provided their contact information, but they have changed their contact telephone number. Or maybe not all the households that provided their contact information are willing to answer the survey questionnaire. So we have a mix of biases here. Maybe we have bias because of coverage, or maybe we have bias because of non-response. So at the end, assume that, for example, 85% of the January sample did provide contact details, and that the probability of a contacted household responding the entire survey is 80%. So in that case, responses will be obtained only from 68% of the original sample, and that means bias. On the other hand, we must pay attention to this attrition effect on the panel. That means loss of participants the longer the panel is used for. And there will be households that will stop responding to the survey because they are contacted repeatedly. So we have to take that fact into account in order to fight against bias. So the main principle here is that people that do not answer or that cannot be reached out differs from people that are effective respondents. So it is highly likely that the respondent households do not have similar characteristics to non-respondent or non-covered households. So there are reasons for household non-response to the survey may be associated with the phenomenon being measured. For example, and that is called non-ignorable non-response. For example, there are more unemployed people in non-respondents households, or non-response rates are higher among households living in poverty. So if we have non-ignorable non-response, we must to change or to adjust weights in order to make this correction. So here you have a figure in which you can find three possible scenarios when identifying selection bias. The graph on the left illustrates a case in which there is no bias. The blue horizontal line corresponds to the published estimate for the month in which the original sample was selected. In our example, it is January. The red horizontal line represents the average of the simulations that we recommend to perform in order to detect if actually there is or there is not bias. And each of the simulations results are represented by the dotted lines. So in the last two scenarios, at the right and in the middle, we can find that most of the simulations do not include in their interval, if you can follow me, the published estimate. I mean, the blue line is far away from the red line. And in one case we have positive bias, and in the other case we have negative bias. So we need to make to perform a research in order to conclude that there is bias. But it is highly likely that we can find some bias. So we are recommending to use two approaches. They can be performed jointly. I mean, in a joint way. I think at first we have this propensity score that it is an approach that was proposed by Rosenbaum and Rubin in 1983, and it is very useful for elucidating the structure of non-response and correct these bias caused by the lack of coverage or non-response bias. So here we have relationship of the response with some covariates, and I mean the idea here is that the statistician can fit this model. I mean, we can know which households responded and which households did not respond. So we can link the response with covariates, and the idea is to estimate this probability of response. And once we have estimated the probability of or the response probability, we can use that estimate in order to adjust the sampling weights here and to obtain final weights. These final weights are bias corrected by this propensity score. And the other methodology that we are recommending is the correction of non-response bias through a two-stage calibration. So in 2007, Sardal asserted that when sample surveys are affected by non-response, it is possible to use this two-stage approach. So maybe you can know that the general purpose of the calibration process is to find a moderate number of constraints that allow approximately unbiased estimates to be calculated with a lower variance than that generated with the original sampling weight. And the idea here is to perform a two-stage calibration in which, in the first stage, the calibration of the original sampling weights could be based on totals for age or subnational region, area, sex, and these figures are available from robust population projections or counts available from a recent census. That must be performed at first, and later, in a second stage, we must to calibrate those weights of the telephone sample, but now based on totals of, for example, per capita income, occupation status, branch of activity, level of education, and those totals are estimated from the original survey. So we have here two approaches that you can use in order to correct the bias. And as I just said, we have made these sort of recommendations based on the sampling strategy. We have focused on the changes that the sampling design must assume, and we have focused on some changes that the weighting scheme must embrace in order to correct this bias. So at the end, the message is do not simply wait. Do not simply wait. Here, I have performed an empirical study. It is a simple simulation, and I have computed these statistics. So here we have some simulations. The black line refers to the expansion estimator, as it is, based on a survey or a sample that have some bias. And here, the green line represents the two-stage calibration approach, and the red line represents the propensity scheme corrections. And in both scenarios, the green and the red one, we can find that we have effectively corrected the bias, because the blue line represents the parameter of interest. So that means that we have here in percentage a bias of maybe 17%, and we have unbiased estimator if we use the propensity score approach or the two-stage calibration approach. So the message is do not simply wait, because chances are that the sample or the effective respondents or that the sample suffer from non-ignorable non-response and coverage bias. So take that into account, and if you want, do not hesitate to contact ECLAC Statistics Division if you require assistance on the design or the analysis of sample surveys or detection of bias and performing of these methodologies, the propensity score and calibration. And you know, Rolando Campo, our director, it is available, and of course also Javier Mancero, the chief of the social statistics unit, and myself, Andres Gutierrez. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here in this webinar, in this Caribbean webinar. So thank you so much.